Thank you so much, Sonal, and thank you to the organizers and to everyone here. It's such a pleasure to be here. Today, I'll talk about two exhibitions staged about 50 years apart in the South Bank Centre, London. The first is Jawaharlal Nehru, His Life and His India, which opened in 1965, the year after his death at the Royal Festival Hall. Go Away Closer, a retrospective of the photographic work of Dayanita Singh, is the second, which opened at the Hayward Gallery in 2013, and which I will frame through the earlier Nehru Show. Both inaugurated new architectural formats for photographic display that relished the accumulation of images, their juxtaposition and seriality, to render a portrait en masse, a synthetic portrait. Such portraits afford relationships, here between individual and nation, the vicissitudes of the mind and the archiving of the museum, between border-crossing mobility and home. These themes thread through both shows, as if Dayanita is commenting on Nehru's, studying the slow decay of hero and nation through its own forms. The switchback between these themes is exemplified in the South Bank Centre itself, which was constructed for the Festival of Britain in 1951 to rejuvenate a nation post-empire and post-war through a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Great Exhibition. Though the exhibition of 1851 displayed the art and industry of a colonial empire at its peak, the festival maintained the model of British achievement, but revised the scope. This was a new autobiography of a nation, as Becky Konikan has described, rather than of a global empire with the former British colonies primarily absent. However, in 1965, just after the death of Nehru, the British lauded the first Prime Minister of India after the country's independence from Britain as a revolutionary, as a protege, and as an opportunity to solidify political ties with India as a bulwark against China. And here I reprise Geeta Kapoor's previous comment about cultural diplomacy. A man and a nation, Nehru, His Life and His India, took over the hall built for a nation reconceived without him in a grand display. And here we see a suite of retired British Army uniforms in the show. Designed by Charles and Ray Eames in conjunction with students and staff at the recently founded National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, which, as Saloni Mathur has elegantly discussed, Nehru had founded under their guidance. The exhibition was visited by over 90,000 people, including the Queen on the left, and Indira Gandhi, who asked the Eameses to develop the show on the right, and she's just visible at the center of the crowd. As you can see from the photographic portraits of Nehru, at least 8 in this frame alone, the exhibition was constructed as a series of walls, as if the pages of Life magazine had been enlarged and stiffened into a maze. The Eameses conscientiously developed, as they said, and I quote, a photographic exhibit in an effort to show as many humanistic aspects as possible about Nehru through a physical structure that included photographs, fabrics, art objects, and sound. Little things to show what makes a man like Nehru great, end quote. Here, Nehru's life, as well as that of India's, is one of documents and documentation. The journalist Prem Bhatia, in a 1965 review of the exhibition, wrote that an uncommon awareness of the value of time made Nehru an unusual Indian. He kept neither his visitors nor his files waiting. It's as if those files transition from documents of purpose to ones of memorialization, waiting for display. Each section of the exhibition was organized as a file, laid out in compartments as on the pages of the brochure. The India into which he was born, towards freedom, a country divided, speaking to the masses, scattering the ashes. These banners and headlines intersperse Nehru's life with that of India's. Nehru's attention to files became the public's file of his and his nation's life. In these photographs of the exhibition models, you can see how the space is divided into smaller ones, like Nehru's wedding on the left and his death on the right. that encouraged the viewer to fill the gap in between the objects and the image. The exhibition also abstracted these events into history walls, as the Eameses conceived of them, which divided Nehru's and India's life by decade and by portrait. Culled from newspapers, negatives, and photographs, the subjects range from Nehru's boarding school mess hall, which we see on the upper left, to industrialization, to a moonlit night in one of the prisons he had been incarcerated in, and a banyan tree. This breadth accords with the Eameses' approach to communication, to a language of vision and of complexity in their terms, of exhibition design. They aimed for their audience, and I quote, to form a coherent picture of human activity by learning to relate isolated bits of information in terms of a large context, be it of Nehru and India, or of a bakery, the computer, or of photography. But the Nehru exhibit encapsulates other aspects of the media and of the heroic. In 1928, Alexander Rodchenko proposed that a true portrait of a leader was not, and I quote, an art bronze or oil portraits, but rather a file of photographs taken of him at work and rest, archives of his books, writing pads, films. He termed this a synthetic portrait, which he defined through Lenin, but the term applies to Nehru and to many others, as we see today. The photographic record is thus the totality of the man in public life, the nation, which Prem Bhatia also connected to Nehru's memorialization in architecture. And here I show you one of the exhibition's photos of Nehru with Indira Gandhi at their home in Delhi. Bhatia noted that Nehru had many critics in his lifetime, and their number has not decreased. But his death has by no means affected the reverence in which he was held while he was alive. Visitors to the Nehru National Museum still weep as they look at his working desk in what was his study. Nehru memorials are springing up all over the country, he wrote. Indeed, Nehru, his life, and his India not only gathered all of these places together in images, but it was also built like an erector set, weighted with sandbags, a mobile museum, a home of files that traveled not only to London, but also to New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. In 1972, it was placed on permanent display in Delhi at the newly built Nehru Pavilion, alongside the Hall of Nations and the Hall of Industries, symbols of Nehru's concept of a modern nation, which I must note is now slotted for destruction by the present government. The mobility of the exhibition gestures towards the idea of Nehru's life as one dispersed across India in homes, museums, and institutions. In Delhi and in Allahabad, as we see here in the photographs of Dayanita Singh. Nehru's bed, his coat, his library, all on display, all beneath the glass of the museum and the glass of the camera. Such attention to Nehru's spaces was included in the exhibition. And on the upper left, you'll see the reconstruction of Nehru's jail cell, for instance, appointed with photographs of the jails of his imprisonment adjacent. Taken by National Institute of Design students, the photos amplify the bricks, cracked floors, bars, and shadows rather than the whole prison, as if stressing a modernity through design that Nehru had nurtured almost as an escape from the colonial prison. Yet an entire wall remained devoted to the lock's refusal of exit, sized up as we see in the red editing lines here and tracing paper. These photographs of spaces become participant in the spaces of installation, offering at once access and collapse. As Dayanita does from inside Nehru's room, the angle shifting slightly as if the bed is breathing as much as the photographer and the visitors, each encased in his or her own attention to the other spectral presence. Nehru did not want to be deified, Prem Bhatia noted in his review in 1965, but this is a wish that not everyone is likely to respect. For a hero can become a god, his house a temple, the photograph an icon. Sunil Khilnani, in The Idea of India, published in 1998, wrote that, and I quote, Indian nationalism was plural, a dhoti with endless folds. Its diversity was emblematically incarnated in the gallery of characters who constituted the nationalist pantheon, whose unaging cherub-like faces are still on display in tea shops and at crossroads across the country. These can be plucked out of Dianita's oeuvre. Rows upon rows of portraits, multiple generations worth, a death mask under a bell jar, clay busts oddly vital, figurines reprising political negotiations. Here we see one of Gandhi. Ancestors framed near the ceiling, and the electrical cords as if the fan's batons could offer the respect of the fly whisk's breeze and the current that of a halo. Yet there are 4 million separate individual men and women, Nehru noted in his discovery of India, which he wrote while in the Ahmednagar jail, each differing from the other, each living in a private universe of thought and feeling. Thus, Dianita's Allahabad is not necessarily about Nehru or even his house, but about a dialogue with a friend. I would travel with people, Dianita recounted. I never knew how to thank them, so I thought I would make accordion-fold books. I would paste in contact sheets. I went to Allahabad with a friend. I put that work together not really to make it about Allahabad or Nehru's house, but as a letter to this friend full of clues and secrets. Thus, a place, Nehru's house, becomes the scene of a friendship and of contiguous loves for writing and for photography. Here we see the friend, Sunil Kilnani, who is writing a biography of Nehru, looking through Nehru's library. Is this Dianita seeing as Sunil then, conversing with him as interlocutor, intuiting him as biographer? It is as much so as about Nehru or about Nehru's bed. For many of these images are in other series, Beds and Chairs, for instance. The quest is not for the hero, the minister, Nehru, or for the friend or place, but for the bed and the impression the body has left there. The German publisher Steidl printed Dianita's intimate picture letters in 2007, transforming the letter into a public document with the clues and secrets seen dependent on the viewer. In Calcutta, Dianita displayed them in the empty vitrines of a jewelry store that we see on the screen. The panwala, Dianita says, who sits just to the side, is the unofficial guide. Ye Nehruji ka ghar hai, this is Nehru's house. Ye Bombay ki tasveere hai, these are Bombay's pictures. To the panwala, it is the personality of the house or the city, rather than the letter, that are the book's defining character. The art world would like one image, Dianita says. I would like to have 500. Thus, she seeks alternative forms, the artist book, and spaces, like the jewelry store, or her portraits of families in Calcutta, that the sitters took from the gallery to their homes. The home becomes a gallery, and her galleries become mobile homes. The Museum of Chance in Go Away Closer at the Hayward includes these alternative exhibitions. And I quote, photographs could have a different life away from the wall, Dianita says. The book is my work. The exhibition is a catalog of my book. I've set it up to pull you into this labyrinth. The past is in these structures, but you complete the story. Thus, the photograph is both hers and yours, and what or who is being photographed. The exhibition Go Away Closer is therefore a synthetic portrait of her life and her India, just like it is of Nehru's. But it is not as much about the history wall or as explicit about politics, but politics run through her work, I believe, but rather of privacy, as one of her projects is titled. The Hayward Show was organized as a retrospective, and here on the right we see Dianita's Museum of Photography. From her work as a photojournalist, to that of a bookmaker, to that of photo architecture, of mobile museums and their permanent home, Museum Bhavan, Museum Home, which is in fact her home. My idea of the museum, Dianita says, is informed by Nehru's house in Allahabad, Indira Gandhi's house in Delhi, house museums. In Tagore's house museum, his uncle's dentures are there. So this is my background. This is what I think of as the power of the museum. Not the Tate or the Met. Nehru's house is not exactly like Nehru left it, but what the keeper, who is not a professional curator, has put on the bedside table, the bed, the table, the glasses. People come with a lot of devotion in a state of reverence, in the same way that they might go to a temple. Dianita's mobile museums are drawn from her archive of over 30 years of making photographs. culled from contact sheets of 12 images each that, as she says, offer new themes at each visitation. These include Museum of Photography, Museum of Machines, Museum of Files, but then she wanted to free herself from the serial image, bed, furniture, printing press. In my head, it's not like that, she says. Thus begat Museum of Chance. Based on a dream in London, as she says, I got into a boat on the Thames and got off at the Assi in Varanasi and walked up the steps to Ma's ashram and went into a room in the Devgarh fort in Udaipur and climbed out the window and landed in a moss garden in Kyoto. The Mobile Museum is a junction of the documentation of real and imagined travel, of how the file and fiction blur. We all have an archive of images in our minds, of history and myth. Nehru segregated these. If my mind was full of pictures of recorded history and more or less ascertained fact, I realized that even the illiterate peasant had a picture gallery in his mind, largely drawn from myth and tradition and epic heroes and heroines, while Dayanita draws these together. There are no illustrations in Nehru's discovery of India, only a circulating cover photo of Nehru in jail. Maps, rather than pictures, illustrate the letters Nehru wrote in another prison, which became glimpses of world history, framed and amplified on the walls of the recreated cell in the exhibition. Dayanita contained these types of maps in her file museum. In a photograph of the Survey of India, for example, the archivist's bicycle leans against the cupboards. The maps are rolled up, edges frayed. Archives hold thousands of documents that offer countless histories. In the late 19th century, many Indian archives were self-consciously modeled on the German historian Leopold von Ranke's method of a positivist, source-based history. Countering colonial commentators' characterization of Indian civilization as being devoid of history, Indian scholars could offer new proofs. The colonial education system that had initiated such a method thus inspired the path towards its own demise. Nehru urged his readers to discover India within a world history from behind the bars of a colonial prison cell. File rooms are sources for revolution, of protection, and also of imprisonment, as written on the cover of manuscripts in Jaipur in 1800, for instance. And I quote, "A book should be adorned like a dear son. It should be purified daily and looked upon like a good friend. It should be tied fast like a culprit sentenced to death, and should always be remembered like the name of God. If so treated, a book never undergoes the state of deterioration." Much of the cheap cloth used to wrap paper bundles of papers in archives was and still is made in local prisons. Colonial officials justified the labor of inmates as reform, and their products were displayed at colonial exhibitions as a revivification of craft. It is tempting to think that some of the textiles in Nehru's show could have been such jailbird productions. And as I've discussed, archives and documents do hold such traces of prisons. There is a stillness and everlastingness about the past, Nehru wrote in his discovery of India. It changes not and has a touch of eternity, like a painted picture or a statue in bronze or marble. Unaffected by the storms and upheavals of the present, it maintains its dignity and tempts the troubled spirit to seek shelter in its catacombs. There can be quarrels between histories, narratives, and counter-narratives that disturb the archive as a place of proof. Perhaps Dayanita's counter to Nehru, his life and his India, to the icon and the document, might be this minute-by-minute decay in her photographs of files neatly bound, tucked in folders, lined on steel shelves, bathed by a tube of fluorescent light. The facts within the documents are of as much interest as the spaces of archives. As Dayanita has said, fact is the burden. Take away what you know from an image and see what's left. These images from Go Away Closer, the book, for instance, are another of Dayanita's picture galleries, where one image could start a new museum through intuition, as she says. I've followed Dayanita's Museum of Files, her Allahabad letter, and other cold images of Nehru. But these offer other totally different stories, women in sparkling evening wear in solitude and amore, the upturned stones of the street, a shop's patient organization of vials. Take Museum of Machines. In a mobile museum on the left and the postcards titled Blue Book on the right. These capture the fading blue factories of Nehru's socio-economic vision. As I've discussed, Dayanita's retrospective was in the South Bank Center, built in 1951, the Hayward in 1968, for the Festival of Britain, a reprisal of the Great Exhibition of 1851. The same year as the Hayward Show, 2013, Dayanita's work was exhibited in the German pavilion of the Venice Biennale. The Biennale also loosely follows the model of the Great Exhibition, but it gathers nations towards contemporary art rather than industry, and as it has gone on, the unofficial pavilions outnumber the official ones, and boundaries blur. India and Pakistan teamed up this past year, just as in 2013, the German pavilion swapped with the French. They sought to emphasize not only their peace after the Second World War, but also the mobility of people, for, as is ever present, there are longings for and limitations to nationality. Dayanita is not British, nor is she German. She stepped out of the ashram in Varanasi and landed in a moss garden in Kyoto, Nehru's dhoti with endless folds. For the Biennale, Ranjit Huskot wrote that the nocturnes collected to form Blue Book, which we see here, one of which, propose a portrait of Damarung, twilight, which connotes the mutual dappling of light and dark, but also in a more mythic register, the time of the fall of God's heroes and icons. We are witnessing the continuation of colonialism into modernism, into globalization, and the reprisal of nationalism in its wake. Both of the exhibitions of Nehru and of Dayanita offer synthetic portraits of public and private persons linked through the dissemination of the photograph and of architecture. A timeline that gets formed like a context sheet, Dayanita has observed, becomes a portrait of the person. One of a hero when the image still promised a hero, a history. The other of a mind in dialogue with other persons, places, and things. Both are admissions of imprisonment in stasis and its moving release.